Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to see already many back from the well-deserved lunch break. I know it's hard now to concentrate again after such a feast, but we hope that our panel now gives you a lot to talk about, to discuss, and I'm very happy to be moderating this next session. My name is Barbara Salcher. I'm the dialogue coordinator of the Khartoum process, a political dialogue and platform of countries along the migration route of the Horn of Africa, East Africa, and Europe. And I'm representing the Secretariat here today. And before we dive into the different panelists, I want to outline what this session will focus on. So this session will now discuss the protection landscape that Sudanese and third country nationals fleeing Sudan face when they arrive in neighboring countries, and also when they move forward. And we will explore how rights and services are ensured at a local, national, and regional level. And for that, I'm very happy to have distinguished panelists here with me today, starting with Dr. Sabelo Mbokazi. He's the head of the Labor, Employment and Migration Division of the African Union Commission and a dear friend of the Khartoum process. We have then Dr. Amira Awad Osman from the Abu Alafia Foundation for Peace and Reconciliation. Welcome. And we have Ms. Ngudai Meskele, Director for the Department of the Rights of Refugees, IDPs and Migrants from the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. Welcome. And to complement the three distinguished panelists, we have a discussant here, Ms. Noor Moussa. She is a researcher from the University of Antwerp and Talent Beyond Boundaries, who will complement the input of the panelists and bring in her findings from the research she has conducted in Egypt and Uganda. So with that, I would like to give each panelist 10 minutes presentation. We do have PowerPoint presentations. You can use the lectern. So Dr. Sabelo, please have the floor.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Are we audible? Oh, yes, we are. Thank you very much, Barbara. And we would like to also convey warm greetings from the African Union Commission and greetings to all of the colleagues. The previous session was important in giving us statistics and data on the entire situation of humanitarian situation with regards to the Sudan. So we would like to remind you about your strategic vision in Africa, the Agenda 2063. So everything that we are doing, including the responses to Sudan, is also anchored on the strategic vision, the Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, which is anchored on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 strategic pillars that are usually referred to as aspirations. These are the African aspirations. One of them is to be a strong cultural identity, valued and ethic. One of them is to be peaceful and secure Africa. I'm highlighting that one because the next slide will express concern. We said our aspiration is to be a peaceful, prosperous, and integrated continent. However, as you can see, bullet number 1, the conflict zone are multiplying in Africa. Sudan is one of them that brings us together today, but also in DRC, in Sahel, and this is a cause for concern for African Union. The statistics was given earlier on, but that is about 11 million people who have moved to neighboring countries. And therefore, the question is, what is it then the African Union is doing? What is it that we can do? There's a strong push for a paradigm shift to recalibrate the humanitarian architecture in order to be able to meet the protection needs on the ground in Sudan, but in other areas, so that the global humanitarian structure in this context, we are able to work with a global humanitarian structure, but within the context of mixed migration trends. I'll give you one example of what the AU is emphasizing. The AU is emphasizing that at a national level, member states should be able to have capacity to be able to respond to the humanitarian needs during the crisis, like we see in Sudan. But not only member states, but also, as you are aware, there are RECs, the regional economic communities. Otherwise, East Africa community should be able to have capacity to respond to the crisis if it breaks out. So this is a paradigm shift that we are talking about. Even in terms of the policies, we are aware that this country, Kenya, at least has the capacity to be able to do status determination. And it's not all countries that are able to do that, status determination for refugees. So that's what we are referring to if we talk about the paradigm shift, so that there's not a total dependence on international community and capacity and capability. The ultimate goal is to build permanent humanitarian infrastructure with capacity to respond to national and REC level, which is regional economic community level, so that we can be able to immediately address the crisis, such as the Sudan crisis. Rapid response to crisis in Sudan should be anchored on human rights. That's what also the AU, in terms of its policies, is advocating for it, that the responses should be anchored on human rights, but also should provide comprehensive prioritization in terms of social services, food, shelter, health, and education. This came out strongly earlier on this morning in the presentations that preceded this one. This session focuses more on policies. So we just want to make reference to the policy that you all know about, the 1969 Convention, OAU Convention, that's focusing on refugees. We also are guided by the Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons in Africa. And all our responses are anchored on these policy frameworks. There is also a protocol. Now this is specific for focusing on human rights, protocol on African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Not forgetting also the global frameworks like the Global Compact on Refugees. We are also guided by this one in our responses. This one is specifically about children, so that we don't leave anyone behind. So there's a policy framework on African Charter on the rights and the welfare of a child. These are just a few policy framework instruments that guide our work on humanitarian affairs, but there's more. But I think our presentation would like to focus more on how do we move from policy to practice. So it is great to see that a number of participants here are really working in the field. The previous session focused on data and research. We also believe to be able to act with an informed with an informed approach, we need to have strengthened data and research. So the previous session is highly appreciated, and we acknowledge that. But conferences like this one also, where there is a dialogue like this Mixed Migration Center, and we highly commend Mixed Migration Center and DRC for this great conference so that we can exchange knowledge and best practices on IDP protection and assistance and safeguarding the lives of refugees. So this platform is important, but there was earlier on, and I would like to emphasize this now because we are focusing on moving from policy to practice. Asylum regime. So in terms of the AU policy frameworks, granting an asylum to refugees is a peaceful and humanitarian act, and therefore this is being encouraged. We know that the neighboring states can feel the pressure, but we emphasize, our policies emphasize the importance of asylum, granting asylum to refugees. Importance about cooperation and partnerships, but we also believe that we need to be able to integrate these humanitarian focused policies to local government, because local governments are the ones that are receiving the refugees. There is also an emphasis on whole of society approach in terms of protection through essential social services. Hard to reach areas also to be able to reduce vulnerability, particularly among women and children, is also emphasized in the AU policies. Now, in closing, here I'm just listing a number of platforms where we could take the data that you would have produced and use it. We have number one, the AU Assembly, where decisions are made, so we can influence that platform. There's also a ministerial, which is number two, which is a ministerial conference focusing on this area, on humanitarian affairs, refugees, and migration. So all these platforms are important, but I just want to highlight one platform which could be an example and an inspiration. Number 7, which is the AU, EU, and UN tripartite task force, where IOM and UNHCR are involved, where we work in Libya to deal with the Libya stranded migrants. So this is an example of what also is possible if partners come together to be able to address the issues. And we believe this could be an example also for Sudan to address the issues of refugees and internal displacement. We thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sabelo, especially also highlighting the dialogues as a way to engage on a policy level, and outlining, of course, the different frameworks that are already in place and that should be followed down from up from the continental level to the REX level, down to the national and the local level. Thank you very much for giving us this overview. Now over to Dr. Amira Awad Osman for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. 600 days of war. The war is still going on in Sudan. The fighting between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudan Army is going on. Both of them are war criminals. Their fighting created the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. It created hunger, famine, diseases, including cholera, and humanitarian crisis in Sudan and outside Sudan. It also created unprecedented internal displacement as well as refugee population almost all over the world. I'm going to focus on Egypt, exploring the refugee policy landscape and mapping refugee actors in Egypt. Egypt hosts 1.2 million Sudanese refugees, and the number is keep growing as long as the war is going on. People prefer Egypt for several reasons. So I'm just asking why Egypt? Sudan and Egypt share a long land border, making travel between the two countries relatively easy, but this is questionable. Is it really easy to go to Egypt? How come 1.2 million people make it to Egypt? There is some kind of cultural and historical tie between the two countries, and people at both sides of the border share culture, they speak the same language, and there is some kind of history between them, and that is facilitate easy movement across the border. There is also a large Sudanese community in Egypt, we call it Jalia. They have been there since 50s, 60s, 70s. People also, before the war, Sudanese used to go to Egypt for tourists, to tour Egypt, particularly during Ramadan. They go there, they stay there. And it is easy to go to Egypt as a tourist than go to France, for example, or America or whatever. So it is easy for them to go to Egypt. They also go and do shopping during social occasions, maybe Eid or whatever. That was so easy because there was no restricted entry to Egypt. They share the language. Of course, both of them speak Arabic, but not all of the Sudanese speak Arabic. But anyway, they feel comfortable to be there because they speak the language. They communicate with Arabic. And that makes them, as some of them told me, not feeling as foreigners. Medical treatments, Egypt has more advanced medical treatment than the one we're having in Sudan. So people go for medical treatment, for education as well. Egypt is also transit to Europe, not only for the Sudanese, but for the other African from, let us say, Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea. They go to Egypt hoping to cross the Mediterranean to reach Europe. Resettlement in the West, many Sudanese, thousands of Sudanese were resettled in the West. That include people who were there because of Darfur War, because of the war in South Sudan, because of the persecution they faced by the Enghaz regime. So resettlement is a reality, it's there. But the problem is people may stay up to 10 years to get resettlement in a Western country, but still there is hope for them. Now, Egypt has got its own refugee regime or law, and of course that affects people there. First of all, Egypt is a signatory to the Geneva Convention, part to the African Convention of the 1969, and it has got a very nice piece of constitutions which says the state shall guarantee political asylum to any foreigner who has been persecuted for defending the interests of people's human rights, peace, or justice. Extradition of political refugees is forbidden. This is a very good piece of constitution, but the reality might be some different. Egypt has no asylum law. However, they have drafted a new law about 2 months ago. The law was debated at the House of Representatives. It was accepted, but it's still not a law, but it's going to be a law. The main thing about this, it allows the government, the Egyptian government, to process the asylum cases and to determine on them. Right. Now, I'm going to focus on two things. First, the border regulation and no-come policy. Of course, there are so many regulations in relation to refugees, but I'm going to focus on these two. And historically, Egypt has got some kind of easy border. People used to move freely between the two countries. There was no restricted visa entry. But the current situation is completely different. People have to get visa, and it's very difficult to get visa. That's why people stay at the border areas for so long, and this has complication on people. People use long and dangerous route to reach Egypt. They rely on unsafe transport. They call them flying cars, where people board cars, those cars drive very fast, and if you're falling out, nobody will stop to pick you up. They pay a large amount of money to smugglers. Visa delays, and many are surrounded in harsh living conditions, and there is a humanitarian crisis at the border areas, not only where they are battlefields. Border areas as well have got their own humanitarian crisis. Egypt also don't have camp policy. Although Africa is believed to be the continent of camps, we have got so many camps in our continent, but Egypt don't have that kind of policy. Ethiopia have camps, Uganda has some camps, but not Egypt. Refugees are not accommodated in camps, and in fact, the President Assisi said refugees are guests, they are not refugees. By guests, meaning that in Arabic culture, guests are welcome, you treat them with generosity, you share with them scarce resources, and so on. So they are welcome, but not refugees. But some critics say that, well, if you are a guest, you don't live for long, you have to stay. You don't live permanently, you stay for some time, and then you leave. UNHCR doesn't provide camps for people, and the refugees themselves, they don't want camps. I'm just quoting this young lady who said to me, we don't want camps, girls would be abused and sexually harassed there. So nobody wants camps in Egypt, not the government, not UNHCR, not the refugees themselves. And this area maybe needs some kind of more research to find out why, which is better for the people. Now we're going to focus on the actors there. We have UNHCR, which is till now is dealing with refugee cases. They register people, they process their cases, and so on. And there are so many criticisms for UNHCR. People are frustrated. They don't feel happy with that because they wait so long to get their status. They don't know their rights. They don't know their obligation. And UNHCR is not helping. There are some regional actors like AU. I think he already spoken about that. We have got different humanitarian agencies and grassroots organizations. I'm going to focus on grassroots organizations because they are the ones there on the ground helping people. The Egyptian grassroots organizations, as well as the refugee-led grassroots organization there, they are doing very hard work to help refugees there. And we have the global north, the rich countries. I'm going to stop here. Do you want me to continue? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Amira, and I think it just shows very well that we need a coordinated approach to address such a big crisis as you outlined. And now it was just it was an example of Egypt, but I'm sure it's also reflected in other neighboring countries. And now for that we have an Ethiopian representative here today. This is also a country affected by taking in Sudanese refugees. So with this, please, Ngudai, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Today I am here not just representing my institution, Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, but representing the voice of 90,000 plus Sudanese refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants hosted in Ethiopia. I'm here to amplify their voices and share their concerns with you. I'll be talking about the human rights-based approach. Why human rights-based approach? Because we are talking about the unique stories of 90,000 plus people who actually suffered human rights violations along in their way to seek refugee. So before jumping into my next slide, I would like to say a few words about why human rights-based approach towards addressing the protection concerns or the concerns of Sudanese refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants hosted in neighboring states. The first reason, because the human rights-based approach recognizes refugees and migrants, like all human beings, are endowed with inherent rights. And again, second reason, it's normatively based on international human rights standards. And third, it's operationally directed to promoting and protecting the rights of these groups. And last but not least, it defines, this is very important to highlight, it defines the rights of these groups vis-a-vis obligation of host states and transit countries. I just moving to the current refugee context in Ethiopia, just to set the tone about what I'm talking about. Ethiopia is a signatory to international human rights standards regarding refugees, the Geneva Convention and the African Convention. In addition to that, Ethiopia is known for putting in place the most progressive refugee proclamation, which provides for comprehensive protection of rights. And it's also, in 2023, Ethiopia entered new commitment at the Global Refugee Forum. Among the six, two of these pledges are directly relevant to the protection of Sudanese refugees and asylum seekers in Ethiopia. And it recognizes prima facie recognition of refugee status. At the moment, Ethiopia is home for over 1 million refugees. Among these, 90,825 are Sudanese refugees and asylum seekers, which means 8% of the refugee population in Ethiopia are Sudanese. Again, it's a major country of origin and also transit for cross-border migration. Irregular migration is one of the biggest challenges. At the moment, there is ongoing conflict in northern part of Ethiopia, which means for refugees, there is increasing protection concern and shrinking protection space. That's why my title says toward human rights-based approach and the role of national human rights institution in addressing the shrinking protection spaces. Just to say a few words about my institution and our interventions so far. Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is a national human rights institution with A status. So regarding the refugees, especially from Sudan, and the migrants as well, we have been conducting human rights situation monitoring. This is a bit different from the protection monitoring everyone was talking this morning. And we have been documenting the human rights violations encountered by Sudanese refugees and asylum seekers. And again, we have been advocating for accessibility, especially access to asylum registration and inclusion of the Sudanese refugees in the existing protection service. And in addition to that, we have been amplifying the voices of Sudanese refugees at regional and global human rights fora. Last but not least, we partner with various entities, institutions for meaningful change. So for instance, before coming to this forum, we held just a couple of weeks ago a consultative dialogue with Sudanese refugee community based in Addis. So I just want to read some of the quotes. I have time. So the first one says, they don't treat us the way they treat other urban refugees. We fled war in our country. We can't go back to our country. We are refugees too. But why don't they treat us the same way that they treat others? Why? Why? Asks one Sudanese main refugee representative. The other added, there is no registration for Sudanese in Addis Ababa. We are supposed to pay visa fee on monthly basis. and the immigration authorities' visa fees becoming unaffordable because we don't work and we don't have income, another added. The last one said they wanted us to go back to the camps in the region, which are not safe for those living in the camps. Of course, we are struggling here too. We are facing risks of detention, movement restriction, and lack of access to essential services, which are affecting all of us. This quote speaks volume about the situation of Sudanese refugees and asylum seekers currently living in Addis. So some of the major human rights concerns we have identified in our extensive monitoring, investigation, and advocacy work. The first one is safety and security. If you see this graph, most of the Sudanese flee to or crossed into the region where we have ongoing security concern and active fighting between the government force and non-state armed group. So which means the refugee settlements and camps are not safe there. And so security and safety is the biggest challenge faced by refugees who are especially hosted in the camps in the Amhara region, Aulala, Kumer, and of course, lately they moved to Aftit. The other biggest challenge is the limited access to asylum registration and essential service. Here again, the Ethiopian government is not yet opening registration, especially asylum registration in Addis Ababa, which means those refugees fled to Addis are not or do not have access to asylum. The third one is discrimination and detention. Most of them, for example, reported discriminatory treatment from the Sudanese embassy based in Addis for renewal of their document, and risk of detention and also deportation because they are not registered. Last but not least, reintegration challenge. So in general, just to wrap up, one of the challenges, the mixed migration movement is the biggest challenge. In this case, I really want to highlight the challenges of those who actually came to Addis with valid visa, and now they turn out to be asylum seekers. So lately, for example, the Ethiopian government registered more than 20,000 refugees, Sudanese refugees in Addis, and registered them as illegal, quote unquote, migrants. We don't use the term illegal because there is no illegal migrant, because they might be irregular migrant, but they can't be illegal. The other challenge is ongoing conflict and lack of access to refugee camps. This is our challenge too, because we cannot access those camps based in Amhara region. The third one is the global funding is shrinking. And this is also a challenge affecting Sudanese refugees based in Addis, but also in the camps. And also the declining or deteriorating humanitarian supports at the camps. The fourth one is issues related to state sovereignty and national security, which are linked to refugees and migration governance in Ethiopia. As you may know, Ethiopia, at the moment, we are having a conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia. So again, this is also posing a challenge. Last but least, the capacity of the state. Like I said earlier, the global funding is declining and shrinking, and this is affecting a response at local level. The way forward, we recommend human rights-based approach should inform humanitarian programming and policy and program action. And so we often say, be it humanitarian or development intervention, it should be anchored to human rights, because the human rights-based approach puts the people first and protection central. Second, rethinking the refugee response is quite important. And third, scaling up the shared responsibility of international community, because this is also highlighted under international human rights conventions and instruments. Because earlier I also mentioned about the declining funding. And so we need advocacy at global level or at higher level. Last but not least, enhancing collaboration and partnership to increase impact. For example, Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is member of the National Protection Cluster, where we often try to bring the human rights agenda to the humanitarian table. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Engodai. And I think you really outlined several challenges neighboring countries face. First of all, their own internal conflicts, also challenged and paired with displacement, internal displacement there. Maybe what also was mentioned beforehand with additional crises such as climate change and displacement. So all those factors increase, of course, access or like the lack of access to safety and shelter and protection. However, what I liked as well is, again, the dialogue and the partnership, which is essential when addressing those challenges. Also, first and foremost, with the refugees themselves, to see what are their needs as well. And then, of course, with partners when it comes to funding and programming. Having heard that, we had now 3 different aspects from our distinguished guests, and now Noor, you did some research on legal and alternative pathways for refugees, and maybe you want to comment and come in with your findings on your research.
Sure. Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you so much to the panelists for setting the scene very clearly. I appreciate your perspective, Dr. Sabilo, on the normative frameworks and what we kind of have to work with, and also then the local realities you shared from both Egypt and Ethiopia. And I think what was shared, especially in terms of the limited avenues for resettlement, Dr. Amir mentioned refugees having to wait for over 10 years to access resettlement, and then what you mentioned also in terms of needing to rethink responses and shift the paradigms. So building on all that has been shared, I think it's important to discuss these complementary solutions and third country solutions. So just by way of introduction, I'm Noor. I'm a researcher working on a project with Talent Beyond Boundaries to think about and unpack these labor mobility solutions for refugees. So what TBB does is skilled migration pathways for refugees. So I think they're the first organization globally dedicated to this. And in essence, they operate like a matchmaker. So on one hand, they have the refugees. There's a platform which they call the Talent Catalog with over 120,000 registered refugees who upload their skills and qualifications onto this platform. And then on the other hand, they work with the employers in countries like the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, countries in Europe who are in need of these skills and are often facing shortages in these skills. And then TBB does the matchmaking, connecting the refugees with the employers, and then addresses the barriers the refugees face in moving to these countries. So in terms of awareness of these opportunities, how to apply for them, but also practical barriers like language testing, visas and processing, travel documents, passports, etc. So globally, I think it's only around 2,500 people who have been offered the solution through these programs by TBB and partners, which is a promising number, but still quite small, right? So these are people who have moved, but also people in the process of moving along with their family members. So what my research is looking at is how can these programs grow and go from like very small pilots and proofs of concepts to much bigger scale. So I'd like to share some findings and insights on how systems and labor mobility systems can be more inclusive of refugees. And I think the first observation really, having spoken to many Sudanese nationals, but also refugees of other nationalities, is the numerous and complex barriers they face in terms of accessing decent work, and especially work that aligns with their backgrounds and their skills and their aspirations. And I think that's been mentioned already by colleagues and mentioned in panels before, so I won't go into that into more details. But just to recognize that the demand is there, and people see their skills and their talents as a way to get out of displacement. Now, in refugee hosting countries, we see many frictions. And I think the first one, and the first important thing for a priority for us, is to recognize these skills and talents when it comes to our narratives and how we discuss what's happening in Sudan and otherwise. We heard earlier that 30% of the population has been affected, people across all classes, professions, skill levels. So how can we, in our framings and narratives, convey that and take that into account, and not just center our framings around vulnerability and protection concerns, but also in terms of skills. And I think also not polarizing skill and vulnerability, which is easy to fall into, and not seeing skill as an exception. And thanks to TBB's data, we do have the data and evidence to back this up, and we also heard earlier about all the data, the wealth of data that exists. Now, in refugee hosting countries, we also see different frictions. So the first being awareness of these programs. So maybe a show of hands here if anyone has heard about Talent Beyond Boundaries before today. Yes, still quite limited. And globally, I think it's 120,000 people registered, including, I think, around 15,000 displaced Sudanese. But it's still quite limited. And we were just in Uganda where we were doing some research, and we were seeing that the outreach is also maybe not equitable, where people maybe in Kampala are hearing about these programs, but in camps and settlements where they don't have devices and connectivity, awareness is really limited. So how can we promote equitable outreach about these programs? The second is in terms of mismatches or misalignments between what the employers are looking for and the skills and talents refugees have to offer. And here the main concern we're seeing, and was mentioned in the first panel as well, is about language. Speak to many participants who can, read and write English really well, but when it comes to maybe conversational skills or English at the workplace, they struggle. And they don't find the support in Egypt and other countries to work on these language skills. And then it's the same for other languages to access opportunities in other countries like Italy and Germany and so on. And then another important avenue is offering opportunities for people to improve their skills and promote these skills. And here I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think there are already quite a few livelihood initiatives and skilling opportunities being offered, especially in Uganda, but also in Egypt. But what we're seeing is sometimes these skills don't necessarily lead to better job market outcomes because they do have the local labor market in mind. But a lot of the refugees are picking up so many different skills and doing all these trainings that are offered, but it doesn't necessarily mean they are able to get a job. So for instance, someone we spoke to took a course in tailoring, welding, graphic design, hairdressing, and the list goes on. But what it means is they sometimes just scratch the surface instead of delving deep into one skill or profession. So how can what is being offered be more transferable and have this mobility in mind? And then another point I want to mention is about offering the tools for refugees to access these opportunities independently rather than just relying on the few opportunities that come through TBB. So that means offering guidance on how to look for jobs and apply for jobs, but also systems and portals need to be more inclusive. So some people mention they can apply, but when it asks about passport number, for instance, they can't finish their job application. And another thing I want to mention here is in terms of our own sector, because a lot of the participants I spoke to had worked in international organizations before, working in operational roles, the procurement, but also monitoring and evaluation, comms, advocacy, and so on. And what they find is they're now locked out. If they're in Egypt, they can't access opportunities for nationals because they're not nationals. At the same time, they're not able to apply for international roles because they think the language gets in their way, or because of their limited work experience abroad in other countries. So I think that's just a question for all of us to think about and act on. And now, last but not least, I want to say that it all boils down to the labor mobility policies. So even though there are these frictions in refugee hosting countries, I think we are seeing lots of barriers in terms of the labor mobility policies in general, in terms of whether an employer even wants to consider these opportunities given the costs and so on, but if someone has the opportunity to move. And here I want to hand over to Ismail. Ismail is an offer holder with TBB and partners. He has an offer to move to the US as a nurse, and I'd like him to share his experience, how he's navigated this pathway and what he thinks of it. Over to you, Ismail.
Thank you. I'm Ismail Suleiman Jihadian, a refugee from Sudan. I have been a refugee for the last 20 years in Kakuma refugee camp here in Kenya. Over the years, I got my formal education here in Kenya, Kakuma refugee camp, got trained by International Rescue Committee, and been employed by them ever since. In 2017, I was fortunate enough to get a chance to move to the US through the UNHCR pathway, but unfortunately was impacted by the Trump administration, of which hindered us from going because we were among the 7 countries that were banned during the Trump administration. So ever since, it becomes very hard and depressing living in the camp because we could not go back to our country, Sudan, because of the ongoing war. And there is no any hope for us to move forward. And also getting work access, especially outside the camp, is also a challenge because of my status being a refugee. Also, documentation is also a problem for us, especially the refugee. So it becomes very hard. On the other hand, there was lack of information because we could not know there are other pathways that a person can be able to apply and move abroad to seek a greener pasture. Until Talent Beyond Boundaries came to the camp and held an information session where we heard about it, because it was not easy to get information based on pathways. So I managed to apply in Talent Beyond Boundaries and was privileged to be elected to work in the US. But unfortunately, when I passed and I got the job offer, again, Trump is the office. So, so I'm uncertain of what will happen next. I'm just waiting, but with hopes that things will get better. So it's also a challenge for us because we don't know what holds ahead. This is my only hope of getting out of this situation of, or also getting this status of being a refugee out of my head. Yeah, but because being a refugee is not easy. For me, especially in the last 20 years, I was stuck in a refugee camp. This is my first time outside the camp, actually. So it's hard. And then maybe I am hoping so that if I'm able to move abroad, things will get easier for us, maybe to further my studies, to be safer, because the camp also it's not safe, since it is near the border between Sudan and South Sudan. So we still feel unsafe there. We really do. Even if we are there for all those while, but we still are afraid. And then maybe, let's say, right now, I mentioned that it is uncertain for us whether we will move to the US or not. So right now I'm in a dilemma because I really don't know what will happen or where the future will be. But I'm hoping that this discussion will be helpful. Maybe we'll come up with a solution that is favorable for the safer mobility pathways and access to job opportunities abroad, and also for the war to end. I'm really hoping the war should end because this is what is causing all of this. Lastly, I would like to thank Talent Beyond Boundaries and Mixed Migration Center, UNHCR, Danish Refugee Council for this discussion, and I hope it is going to be a fruitful one. Thank you.
Thank you, Ismail, also for sharing your story, because I think we speak here about so many numbers and thousands and millions of people, and we don't have faces, but you give this a face, and I think it makes this much more yeah, important for us to see, especially the situation you have faced with the last 20 years being blocked of possibilities. And I think to avoid this and to have opportunities like the talent beyond boundaries is very good initiatives to see their future. There's a better future. There's more opportunities for the ones who have been displaced for many years, but at the same time for the ones who are newly displaced. And of course, we all should aim for avoiding conflicts that cause it. Thank you very much. I have now a second round of questions to our panelists before we open the floor to the for the audience. Dr. Sabello, you were talking a lot about different frameworks, policy frameworks, but also platforms for policy discussions, being also part of the Khartoum process, but also having other initiatives. So what is the AUC offering for countries, not now in the east of Africa, but in the whole continent on those mapping the policy landscape on protection?
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The platform that I will mention, just one of them, which is important, is an annual platform that is called Symposium on Humanitarian Issues, but also I would couple that with what we refer to as Livingston syllabus. During the symposium, we bring in all the players, we bring in all the actors within the space of humanitarian issues, humanitarian affairs, from government, from international organizations and NGOs, so that we can be able to update the players, but also exchange information. So this conference comes at the heels of the symposium, which was also held here in Kenya. But also in terms of capacity building and advocacy, we have what we call Livingston syllabus, where we train the policymakers, the ambassadors, and all the players that matter in the area of humanitarian affairs, humanitarian space, to train them on key issues that relate to humanitarian affairs. So those are the two: capacity building and dialogue for information exchange in the Symposium on Humanitarian Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sabello. And now, Dr. Amira, what are coping mechanisms of Sudanese refugees you have identified that you would like to outline here more specifically?
Okay, yeah. As Nourka just mentioned, people have skills. Sudanese refugees in Egypt have many skills. Some of them are teachers, workers, businesswomen. They have tried to engage in some kind of activities, trading, opening of a cafe or hairdressing, just to earn some kind of money to support themselves. They also rely on diaspora communities, relative abroad, in the Gulf, Western countries, and so on. Those people, they send money to them. Also, there is some kind of avoid confrontation, particularly in neighborhood where there is some kind of negative attitude towards refugees. So don't go and fight, just keep quiet, mind your own business. Other coping strategy is if you want to do, understand the law and don't get involved in any illegal activities, like, for example, black market for currency. If you have got money, you go to the bank and you do legal money transfers, that kind of thing. So they can cope, they can live in an environment which has got negative and positive attitude towards Sudanese refugees in Egypt.
Thank you very much. And I think you mentioned the diaspora, which I think is in every country a very important group to support their fellow citizens, but also to help and support in integration in neighboring countries. Ngudai, you mentioned that the challenges arise mainly also with visa or the legal status that comes with extending, for example, tourist visa, and then being not more regular in the country. So how is the human rights? How are the human rights dynamics in this regard? And also how what happens to those refugees or to the overstayers, so to say?
Thank you so much, Barbara. I think that's quite relevant question in the case of Sudanese refugees in Ethiopia, because like I said earlier, those who came to Addis, they just flew to Addis with tourist visa. And then after 90 days, 3 months, the question triggered or popped up was about the overstay and their status as unlawful migrants, or the government used the term illegal migrants. But for us as National Human Rights Institution, for example, we have been closely working with Sudanese refugees / asylum seekers based in Addis, because even if we claim them or we treat them as migrants are also entitled to human rights protection. And one is, of course, the protection against deportation or refoulement, because the principle of non-refoulement is the cornerstone of refugee protection. So for us, and also in this regard, UNHCR also agree with our approach. They are refugees for all international protection, because they fled war in their country. As some of them during our consultation said, they cannot go back to Sudan at the moment. And now the issue is the government cannot or do not want to open registration in Addis. And they ask them to go back to the regions where there is active fighting and clash, especially the Metemma reception center, and of course, Benshangul region is relatively safer. But again, here, most refugees, I think this is very important. I think for us, we have been saying we need to also take into account their experience and background. Most of them, for example, came from Khartoum. Some of them are doctors, some of them professionals. So they were saying, we cannot go back to the regions, including Benshangul, we can't stay in the camps. And again, they have been talking about the language barriers, etc. So for us, what we've been advocating, especially for the last 7 months, is we are mainly focusing on access to asylum. And we have been pushing the Ethiopian government to open registration regarding the Sudanese in Addis. Otherwise, at the moment, they are at risk of further human rights violations. And one is, registration is important. Without registration, we cannot make sure protection against arbitrary detention and deportation. So that's why we've been advocating for registration, for the government to start registration in Addis. And for us, whether they are treated as migrants or refugees, they are still endowed with human rights and entitled to protections. And we've been asking the Ethiopian government to comply with its own commitment under the Geneva Convention and at regional level, at African Union level. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ngudai. And for Noor, what's the way forward? Like you have now, we have heard you have 120,000 people in your system right now, but what are the plans? Are you scaling up? Are you broadening to other countries? How is funding secured? So how, what's the plan?
Thank you. Yes, I think in terms of scaling up, we hope that this research really does inform, and it is showing that there is potential for scale. And we have been focusing on refugee hosting countries and the frictions in these countries in the hopes of, addressing them. But as we heard also from Ismail, some of the biggest barriers lie in destination countries. So this is where we need to unlock more opportunities, working with employers to incentivize them, and growing the number of opportunities available. And I think another important piece is to link this with also host country nationals and their opportunities to move abroad, because you do need the buy-in from governments in terms of things like addressing exit permits and so on. And what sometimes we heard they come back and say is, what about our host country nationals who want to migrate as well? Yes, maybe they don't face the same barriers, but they also face barriers in accessing skilled migration pathways. So how do you frame the narratives into looking at not just refugee labor mobility, but mainstreaming it into labor mobility programs in general? And here, recognizing the development benefits is very important. So Sarah, who is the monitoring and evaluation lead at TBB, just shared with me that 86% of candidates are sending remittances at 1 year after relocating. And they're sending these remittances back to the refugee hosting countries where their families are there. And a lot of the candidates we spoke to are hoping to, then be in a place where they can themselves sponsor and act as employers to bring in more people. So this I see in terms of the scale-up question. And I think Sarah can talk more about the funding from TBB, maybe more qualified to answer that. Yeah.
I hope that this continues, so I hope that the initiative will have and continues with this success, and so hopefully also for you, Ismail, that that the new administration in the US is not hindering those plans. Thank you to my distinguished panelists. Thank you for the audience for such a great discussion. They are here for another today and tomorrow, so do you have time and possibilities to exchange bilaterally. And with this, we close this session and we go for coffee break for half an hour.